right, so today I'm very pleased to have my very own colleague, Sangeeta, join me in presenting on the topic of ageism in healthcare. So Sangeeta is a registered occupational therapist with experience working across the continuum of care. And I have a master's in public health and have been working in the field of knowledge translation in healthcare for a number of years. And together we work on the RGP of Toronto's senior friendly care implementation, resources, development, and spread, of course, along with a fabulous team. And we're excited to kick off the first of our health equity webinar series on ageism. All right, so there are no conflicts of interest to declare. Would just like to state that we have some funding from the Toronto region and the Central Region of Ontario Health, as well as the Canadian Frailty Network. And today our objectives are threefold. We want to define ageism and discuss why it's important, why it affects us all, and identify ageism in healthcare and explore strategies to address ageism in healthcare. So without further ado, we'll dive into our first objective, which is around defining ageism. And rather than sort of, starting off with the text definition, we thought we would play a brief video that illustrates ageism in action. So here we go.
How much did you say?
$3.45.
Really? Just a minute. Oh. Okay.
Oh my God, really? Could she at least pull out a bill?
I know. My mother does this all the time.
Yeah, what is that about?
Does it occur to anyone that some people need to go home?
What's that one? Oh.
That's a penny. We don't take those anymore.
Oh. Oh.
It's okay, honey. Take your time.
Oh my God, look at her. She couldn't be cuter.
All by yourself. I bet it's her first time.
Got a couple more?
I remember doing that.
Yeah, that's what it's all about.
One more. There you go. Perfect. Thank you so much. Enjoy your hot chocolate.
Hair size.
Yeah.
All right, so a brief but thought-provoking video. And of course, this particular example is quite pronounced and obvious, but ageism can happen in subtle ways too, and still have significant consequences. And ageism does impact various aspects of life, including healthcare, but its underlying causes are the same. And so we'll get into that further along in this webinar. So these are two definitions of ageism. And the first actually was developed by Dr. Butler, who was a physician and gerontologist from the 1960s. And he described it, he actually coined the term, and he described it as a process of systematic stereotyping of and discrimination against people because they are old. And the second definition from another expert, which I find quite interesting, is a prejudice against our feared future self. And so that's one of the unique things about ageism as compared to other forms of discrimination is that it affects all of us because we all someday, if we are lucky, will be older adults. And so whether or not we feel like older adults today, we are actually all in the process of aging. And yet we see ageism all over in our society. We see it, in the media and entertainment, education, and various aspects of life. And healthcare certainly is not exempt from this pervasive ageism. So at several points in this webinar, we will have opportunities for you as the audience to pause and reflect. We really want you to engage your mind in these concepts. And so this is the first opportunity for reflection. And we have two questions that we want you to think about. First, how will the messages we are absorbing about aging now affect our own perception of ourselves as we age? And secondly, how will pervasive ageism impact our own experience of aging? So I'm going to pause now and give you a few moments just to reflect on that. If you'd like to paste something in the chat, please do. If you'd like to remain silent, that is also perfectly all right. All right, so I do see a comment in the chat box. Thank you for that. And I hope that the rest of you were able to have some insights on the questions that we just had. So keep those juices flowing as we continue on through this webinar, and we will have an opportunity for questions and comments later on as well. So why worry about ageism in healthcare? So we know from very recent research, comprehensive research, that age discrimination, negative age stereotypes, and negative self-perceptions of aging actually can influence healthcare costs, and they can worsen health outcomes. So that's quite powerful. And as I said earlier, this is important, of course, at this very moment because of all the older adults in our health system, and secondly, also for our future selves, because we also will be recipients of healthcare later on in life and potentially have experience some of these effects. So it's very important to consider this issue. Next slide. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper now into what ageism actually looks like in healthcare. Next slide. All right. So before we dive specifically into healthcare, we did want to talk briefly about how does ageism happen at an individual level. And so we know from science that the way our brain works is that we're bombarded every day with millions of bits of information, and we need a fast way of sort of processing all of that, particularly, for example, in a busy clinical environment. There's so much to take in, so many decisions to make. And so our brains are hardwired to sort of make snap judgments, cognitive shortcuts. We go on autopilot, and in that process of trying to be efficient, we develop some blind spots. We rely on past experiences to help us interpret what we see today. And so it happens to the best of us. This is completely normal. And not all biases are bad. We might have a bias towards our favorite sports team or a favorite food. But when our blind spots and biases are based on negative stereotypes, those can have some real consequences. And so that's really what we want to develop an awareness of. And so I'm now going to turn it over Okay, so actually we'll pause first, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sangeeta for the remainder of this presentation. So this is actually the second moment for reflection in this webinar. So we have 3 questions for you. And this is again with the lens of this happens to all of us. This is the cognitive shortcuts, the biases that we want to develop an awareness about. So the first question, have you accidentally assumed that an older adult was cognitively impaired when they were in fact not? Has this ever happened to you? Have you cut off an older person during an assessment because you felt they were talking too much? Have you ever wished an older adult would hurry up? So again, take a moment to reflect. If you'd like to paste in the chat box, please do. I can see some comments coming in the chat box. Thank you so much for your vulnerability. That's I really want to just say thank you for that, because it's you're being brave by sharing these comments with everyone, and it just creates an environment that confirms that we all have those moments. So thank you for that. All right. So keep those comments coming, keep it flowing. And I'm now going to turn it over to Sangeeta to continue on with our topic for today.
Thanks, Alekhya. And thank you again. I want to echo Alekhya's sentiments. Thank you so much for your comments and for sharing your reflections. We really appreciate them. So Alekhya talked about why we should all care about ageism and helped us understand how our cognitive processes can end up reinforcing stereotypic thinking when we take mental shortcuts. Interestingly, looking at the research, what we see is that, pardon me, ageism in healthcare is not so much about an individual care provider being ageist, but rather that there are elements at the structural, organizational, and individual levels that intersect to create a system that is really not geared to address the care needs of older adults. So at the structural level, we see ageism affects the way healthcare providers are trained. Stereotypes of older adults are pervasive in medical and gerontology textbooks. Few medical and nursing schools have in-depth or standalone courses on geriatrics. And then when we look at public policies, the requirement for older adults to exhibit frailty in order to receive services can in turn influence the way service gatekeepers see older adults. We all know older adults in our personal lives, and we see them as whole persons. And yet when we move into our practice contexts, this changes. The risk for care providers around programmatic requirements of frailty lies in the fact that it can inadvertently start to entrench a perspective of aging that is solely focused on losses and deterioration. The fact that we are not given a good grounding in geriatrics in our training to begin with, and then find ourselves working almost exclusively with a specific portion of the older adult population, can create a skewed and negative perspective of aging for us. Next slide. At the individual level, research shows us that negative attitudes towards older adults persist in the health community across professional disciplines and across care settings. And lack of education and preparation can lead to provider discomfort and frustration with caring for older adults. Older adults do require more time to assess and present with more complexity. And this complexity for individual providers who are rushed for time can create a sense of pressure and stress. Additionally, specifically related to aging with cognitive impairment, Research shows that dementia awareness and knowledge of responsive behaviors in settings such as acute care is low. And in this context, behavioral complications are often exacerbated. This causes frustrations, compromises patient and caregiver satisfaction, and we see a stigmatization of the person with dementia emerge. Next slide, please. So the result of these intersections is what older adults experience as ageism in healthcare. Here is one example.
After introductions were made, Dr. B virtually ignored me. He addressed all of his questions and remarks to my wife. She politely suggested that he talk directly to me, but to no effect and no change in his attitude. Dr. B examined my feet and lower legs. He had me walk around so he could observe my motions and the overpronation, etc. Again, when he had completed these examinations, Dr. B addressed my wife, looking only at her and referring to me as if I were either not there physically or was incapable of comprehending him.
Here's another one.
One that I remember was when I had to take my husband to the ER because of blocked nephrostomy tubes for the third time. There was another older lady there with her husband as well. I noticed they weren't answering her questions or were very short with her. When the doctor came to take my husband aside to blow the tubes, I said, surely I could do that if I was shown how. Save some ambulance trips. The doctor stopped, looked at me for the first time and said, I think that would be possible. You're not some feeble old lady. I was a bit stunned, have never forgotten it, and decided then and there to never appear as a feeble old lady to a doctor.
Powerful words. So how do we address ageism in healthcare? There is a lot of emerging research on identifying and addressing implicit bias in healthcare, and we invite and encourage you to explore some of the resources we have listed at the end of the slide deck. Here are our research-based 5 steps for identifying and addressing implicit bias. Next slide, please. And the next one. Step 1, recognize the potential for bias. Let's think back to what Alekhya mentioned about mental shortcuts. What we sometimes experience as a gut response could actually be an emotional response based on our unconscious bias. So when experiencing a gut response, slow down and engage in deliberative reflection. This is the most effective strategy to counter the stresses and pressures of work that can distract and derail us. If unsure about something, ask questions to gain a better understanding of your patient. Think of other ideas to learn about the older adult in front of you, because it is difficult for bias and understanding to coexist. Next slide. Step 2, use evidence-based assessments. Strive to keep your observations and assessments systematic and objective. This will also help you to be transparent in your decision-making and provide clear evidence for the conclusions you draw from your assessment. Next slide. Step 3, be open to different perspectives, to new experiences, and to learning about different identities. Be openly curious about the person in front of you. Ask yourself, how am I ensuring that I'm open to the lessons that live within the person in front of me? We cannot be experts in all the intersecting identities that we encounter, but we can develop an attitude of readiness to learn. Next slide. Step 4, acknowledge the impact of unintentional mistakes. It is important to recognize that while our intention may not have been to deliberately hurt, the impact of our words and actions may be experienced differently by the recipient. Remember, intent and impact are distinct, and we have to consider the other person's past experiences in order to understand impact. Next slide. Step 5, and most important, apologize to rebuild trust. An apology goes a long way to repair a relationship and rebuild trust. Avoid the use of the word if. For example, if what I said or did. This creates doubt about the legitimacy of the person's feelings. Instead, be direct and own your actions and words. For example, I apologize for saying or doing. Next slide. So Alekhya mentioned this earlier as well. Ageist assumptions proliferate in our everyday conversations. So with that said, what we thought we'd do was try out this activity with you. We're calling it, Can You Spot the Assumption? We will put up a statement, which you may have heard yourself before. We would like you to take a moment to consider each statement, look for the ageist assumption in it, and then post your comments in the chat box. This is an exploration for all of us, and we are very okay with silence in this webinar. So if you want to take a moment to reflect on the comment, that's okay. Next slide. So here's the first statement. I treat all of my patients the same, regardless of their age. Ageism is not a concern for me. What is the inherent assumption in this statement? Please take a moment and share your thoughts and comments.
Okay, thank you. See some comments coming in. Janine says, this reminds me of the I don't see color statement. Yes, there are some similarities. Others say we cannot treat everyone the same. We are all different. So the assumption is that we're all the same, blissfully unaware of the person's lived experience. And it's as if age doesn't matter when in fact it does. Yes. Wow, these are these are wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, so there's an assumption that age does not impact experience and need. And people of all ages, yeah, similar sort of theme. People of all different ages don't have the same needs. So it's as if age doesn't matter when it does.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Not person-centered. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. I think everyone's captured our points on the next slide. If we could move to the next one. So the assumption that older and younger people are all the same and everyone needs equal treatment or accommodation. And we know that an equal approach is not necessarily a fair approach, and treating all patients the same, just as our participants already commented, runs the risk that we ignore their unique needs, their perspectives, and their contexts. One example I like to think of is, a single point cane, for example, is not the answer to all mobility concerns. And it's the same for the people we work with. Thank you so much. This is great. Let's move on to the next one. The aging boomers will create a huge strain on the healthcare system. We must prepare for the silver tsunami. What is the inherent assumption in this statement? Please share your thoughts.
Okay, so we have some comments popping in. So older people are a drain. Assume that people won't age well and that aging equals a lack of health. Burden, that aging is akin to disaster. Yeah, that older people have lost value. Yeah, similar themes.
Use of the term boomer, yeah.
Yeah, the term silver tsunami presents the idea that we weren't aware of the aging population, puts blame on them. Yeah.
And the term tsunami itself, with all its connotations of disaster and ruination. Thank you. This is wonderful. Next slide, Sarah. Again, I think the group has captured most of the thoughts that we had. And the idea that a generational cohort, simply because they are aging, are seen as a drain on resources and a problem to be solved. It others the whole cohort and creates an us versus them mentality, and reinforces the perspective that more for them will mean less for me and mine. I mean, no one is arguing about the legitimacy of resource needs, but the reality is any influx of resources will actually help everyone, not just older adults. But when we couch these resource needs in language that is ageist, it creates this us versus them mentality, which is really problematic. Okay, let's try one last one. Next slide, please. In my work, I have to deal with the losses, decline, and deterioration associated with aging on a daily basis. What is the assumption in this statement? Good point, Julia. Who's aging?
It's a good one. Deal with, quote unquote. Yeah. Deal with rather than support. Focus on loss of ability, not remaining strengths. Yeah. Negative view of aging. I like this one. Sounds like this person needs a break or some supports to help her handle her caseload. Yeah, it's that's a very important aspect as well.
Yeah.
Or him, yeah. Yeah, so lots of similar themes coming through around focusing on loss instead of insights and experience, compassion fatigue. Yeah.
This is clearly like preaching to the choir. This is an enlightened group I think we have here. Alekia, you've captured most of the points that we had talked of. Sarah, if you could move to the next slide. So the assumption here is that there is a strong and unquestioned association between aging and decline and deterioration. The whole person is not viewed in their totality, and existing attributes and capacities may be ignored. And we talked about this earlier in the presentation as well, that in our setting particularly, this is a risk because it may frame and negatively impact assessment, intervention, and team interactions with the older adult. This idea of aging being synonymous with loss and deterioration is not new, and yet we know this to be wrong. If asked, we could all name older adults in our own lives who continue to be active, engaged, and productive, volunteering, helping with grandchildren, and being core participants in our social and emotional lives. And negative words such as these paint a narrow picture about aging and older adults in our own imagination, and eventually impact the ways we see our own aging as well. So let's take a moment to think about the words we use, because these words tell stories which frame our perspectives. To explore this further, I will now pass it over to Alekia. Thank you.
Thanks, Sangeeta, and thank you everyone on the line for your fabulous comments and engagement. So thus far, we've talked about ways that each of us as individuals can be anti-ageist. And so I've got a couple more things here around what organizations and teams can do to address ageism and create an environment that really does not allow for ageist behaviors and actions, etc. So one practical thing is encouraging the use of person-centered language in team communication and documentation on patients. And so on the screen here, you can see some examples. So rather than using the word screamer or disruptive, instead trying something like person appeared in distress and called out loudly during morning care. And not only is that more person-centered, it also provides some details that can aid in care planning. It's more specific. And so these examples actually come out of a person-centered language guideline that was developed by the Toronto Academic Health Sciences Network. And I'm going to ask Sarah if you could paste a link to that guideline in the chat. So we have the guideline there for you. We also have another webinar on this whole how to put this guideline into practice. So if you're interested, please do check that out. And next slide, please, Sarah. The second thing is to encourage more staff to get training on how to care for older adults. So we at the RGP of Toronto have developed the Senior Friendly Care Learning Series. It is now available online as of December, and it is free. Learners can self-enroll, complete the modules at their own pace. So, we recognize it is an unprecedented time, so doing training might feel, like a lot, but the way we've designed this is so that it really can be spaced out and can be done in little bits at a time. So, and Sarah's pasted the link in the chat if you're interested in learning how to enroll. And if you would like to enroll a large cohort, for example, a whole group at your organization, do get in touch with us. We'd love to help you get that organized. Next slide. All right, so just in summary, these are the 5 top tips for how each of us can be anti-ageist in healthcare. Recognize the potential for bias, use evidence-based assessments, be open to different perspectives, acknowledge the impact of unintentional mistakes, and apologize to rebuild trust. So we have actually summarized all of this in a handy tip sheet. Sarah is going to paste the link to that in the chat box. This is something you can print off, you can share it with your teams, you can post it in your workspace, and we hope that that is a helpful, reflective tool for you. Next slide, please. All right, so questions. We'll open up the floor if you have any questions or comments for us today. And while people are thinking, I want to ask one question of Sangeeta, and that is, what if, so now we've gone through all these tips around how I can be anti-ageist, but what if I see ageism happening on my team or at my workplace? What do I do then?
That's a really good question, because we don't work alone in healthcare. We do work in teams, and it can feel like it's really difficult, challenging to speak up sometimes in front of our colleagues and challenge their assumptions. My suggestion would be that rather than trying to do it alone, look for allies. So there are likely team members who think like you, who have similar perspectives, and it doesn't have to be a formal, movement or anything, just part of everyday conversation. So, for example, in team rounds, if someone makes a comment that seems ageist when they are speaking about a patient who's an older adult, maybe gently asking for clarification or asking for more explanation around the terms that are being used, and offering alternatives. And I see some lovely examples coming in here. Demonstrating by example can be really helpful. That's a very powerful strategy. And Mario wrote, ask questions that promote self-reflection rather than it being perceived as confrontation. Absolutely, yeah.
That's fantastic. And what I was going to add to that is similar to what Mario just said, is to have compassion for the person or the people who are displaying these ageist behaviors. Seek understanding, have a healthy curiosity, as opposed to sort of having more of a potentially combative type approach.
Yeah.
So any other questions? I did see one question that was around, do you have any favorite books or you potentially articles that you've read, Sangeeta, that might be helpful for people?
So some of the research that we did were in preparing to present on this topic, we've got it at the end of the slide deck, so you'll have that. And we invite you to read those, some of those articles. They're really interesting in terms of identifying ageism in healthcare, but also looking at strategies to mitigate implicit bias. I haven't actually come across a favorite book per se, but if anyone in the group has one, we'd welcome your thoughts, and if you could share, that would be great.
Yes, please do paste in the chat if you've read any good books. Caitlin has just posted This Chair Rocks by Ashton Applewhite. Oh, a couple of people have read that, so check that out. Another fantastic question. What do you suggest people do when they are at the receiving end of ageism? It's a great question.
That's a good one, yeah. Because I have to say, in some of my interactions with the healthcare system now, I have started to experience, I'm not quite sure if it is ageism, or if it's just that people are really rushed. And my response usually has been to just say, could you please explain that to me again? Or I didn't quite get that, but I can see how it would be really challenging for someone who is not part of the system. It's a very intimidating experience to be on the receiving end, and a surprise as well. So.
And I think the same same principles apply, asking curious questions to seek understanding. And I see Mario has posted some really helpful comments. I'll address one quick question that's just come through. Is there a cost to the e-learning? No, absolutely not. It is free. So you can go ahead and self-enroll.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Julia mentioned I try to ask my students, can you be more specific? That tends to transform a comment of she's confused to a more descriptive comment like she was not oriented to time. Excellent strategy. I loved this one from Sasha. Education is key. People are not inherently evil. They are often unaware that their actions, words are offensive and are willing to adapt with the right information. I love that attitude and that approach, that openness to other people's perspective. And I think Mario's asking, can I promote the e-learning to different organizations I support? Wholeheartedly, yes.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Any final questions or comments from the group? Okay, if not, we will attempt to wrap up here and give you a few more minutes in your day. So Sarah, if you could advance the slides. So as we said, we will have a reference slide for you. We'll send this out after the webinar. Next slide, please. And as always, please give us feedback. Sarah is going to paste the link to the survey in the chat box. And if you could take a few minutes just to fill that out, would really, really appreciate it. And our final slide is advertising our next webinar, which is going to be Mario, who's been active in the chat box, is actually going to be our speaker. And that will be on February 5th. And the title is Uncovering Our Diverse Care Environments. So please do sign up for that. We would love to see you there. And that's all, folks. So have a fabulous Friday afternoon, and we hope to see you very, very soon.
Thank you so
Take
much
care.
for joining us.